What are you going to do for a burn down in your crop this spring? Well, whether you have corn or soybeans, the key is that you start clean. So whether you're doing that with tillage or with herbicide, whatever it is, we just want to make sure that when that crop emerges, there are no weeds out there. It's going to make things so much easier for all the rest of the season.
Well, you talk about just starting clean. I think the important thing is making sure we start clean without damaging our crop with whatever it took to start clean. Let's just take 2,4-D for example, because to me, that's a real common culprit. You know, with 2,4-D, if we're spraying that out ahead of corn, it's okay to some degree, but we've got to have a good length of time in front of when we're going to be planting corn. If you're going to spray 2,4-D out in front of soybeans, it's going to be a disaster some years. Now, there may be a few years that, you know what, the weather was just right, there were lots of weeds out there, it used up the 2,4-D, it completely broke down before the beans started germinating and there was no problem at all. But more times than not, we end up with issues, whether it's we completely kill soybeans or we just ding them up enough that instead of getting 60 bushel beans, we get 55 bushel beans. And in the fall, if you get 55, you say, well, you know, I was shooting for 60, but maybe we didn't have good enough weather or maybe we didn't have a timely rain. You don't really know what took 5 bushels off your yield. But in the meantime, you lost $50 an acre out there because you tried to save a couple of bucks on a burn down application.
Well,
so
it's not, yeah, but it's not so much as saving a couple bucks, Darren. It comes down to tough weeds like a mare's tail, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the show when we get into our 3-Pre program with soybeans. But the whole thing is, if you're going to go out with 2,4-D, you have to have lots of time before you plant. And it's different where you farm. In the northern area of the country, there's absolutely no way I'd ever use 2,4-D in front of my corn or in front of my soybeans in the spring. If I farmed down south and I was going to go out in January and spray 2,4-D and come back in late March or early April, I may consider using some 2,4-D if I had a 2-month gap there where I'm going to have a bunch of 70 and 80 degree days. We just don't get that in the northern part of the country. So we just are really, really concerned about you using 2,4-D at all ever in a burn down in front of any crop. It's just too hard on things a lot of times. What we would suggest instead is switch over to Banville with corn. On the soybean side, use some combination things. Use some Valor or Authority plus some Metribuzin plus some fertilizer. The main thing is we just want to make sure you're not using something that can potentially hurt your crop.
But you do need something that's going to be fairly strong out there. And depending on what weeds you're going after, let's take the broadleaf weeds for example. If you've got some winter annual weeds, they got to start last fall. They've got a big root system underneath them and they are as much actively growing out in the field as anything. You may have some spring annuals that are just getting started, but these winter annuals are ready to run.
All right, so let's talk specifically then in corn. What do you suggest in corn for a burn down?
Well, if you've got big winter annuals, like let's say mare's tail, for example, you've got some big shepherd's purse, pennycress, those types of weeds, I really prefer using some dicamba. I would just as soon use a generic Banvel at this point, or if you want to spend the money on Status, you sure can.
Status is sold out, not going to work. It's too expensive anyway to use before
it
that
works,
corn is in the ground.
It works better than dicamba, but like you say, it is a little more spendy. I'd probably go cheap since I'm not in crop. I don't need the safe
Okay, so in other words, Banville and then Sharpen would be probably the next best thing.
Well, yes, but you can buy your Sharpen relatively cheap by going through Verdict. That way you're also getting your residual with some Outlook in there too. So you could go straight Sharpen if you want to, but I would prefer to go Verdict plus some Banville.
Okay, so certainly you can use Roundup as a burn down, but there are a lot of these weeds becoming Roundup resistant. Even if you throw Roundup out there as a burn down for corn, we would suggest throwing Banville and or Sharpen along with it.
Now the other thing with that too is you can throw in a crop oil, a methylated seed oil, liquid fertilizer. You could use liquid fertilizer as your carrier. All those things are going to add to the speed of your burn. So if we're talking about annual weeds, that's a good thing. You'll fry them down quicker. That should be good for this year's crop. If we're talking about perennial weeds though, then we're looking at a high rate of Roundup that's going to get down into that root system and kill the weed root and all.
Okay, let's switch gears, talk about soybeans just a little bit. This is the much tougher one because obviously today you can't use Banville or 2,4-D right at planting time. Hopefully in a couple years when we have dicamba and 2,4-D tolerant soybeans, it's going to be awesome. We're going to have much better burn down options. We just don't have those today. So what we would suggest is using a high rate of Roundup, throw that along with Valor or Authority plus Metribuzin, that's the old Sencor. Now, I would say this, with Metribuzin, if your soil pH is above 7.4, you're gonna have to cut the rate back a little bit, okay? Or even if you have real sandy ground, you're gonna have to cut the rate back a little bit from the normal 1/3 of a pound. Cut it back a little bit, you should be fine. One other thing you can do if you've got Roundup resistant weeds is to use Gramoxone as a replacement for Roundup in a burn down situation. Just remember, gramoxone has to be used before any crop comes up. It's going to burn everything down. It's not going to kill the roots very well, but at least it will burn everything down, and it'll burn it down quickly. Those are the real keys. Those are the best burn down products. Plus, you can consider throwing some methylated seed oil, some fertilizer, something like that with it to heat it up even more.
Now, the one thing that I would say too, we talked about sharpen just a little bit. We love it in front of corn. We love it in front of wheat and soybeans. You just can't use a high enough rate. We'll probably get into that as the show goes on today. So yes, that is an option, but when you can only use an ounce, you really don't get that much burn down activity on the big winter annuals. If you had just small 1-inch tall annual weeds, yes, you'd get a sufficient burn down, but not as much residual as things we'll talk about later on.
Once again, it kind of comes back to if you're after the annual weeds, we can get a lot of burn on them, especially adding some fertilizer, the crop oil or methylated seed oil, those types of things. But for the perennials, just like we said with the corn, we'd prefer to have you run with the highest labeled rate of Roundup, do a nice strong shot of Roundup, and you should have better luck getting down into those deep root systems of the perennial weeds. So it really depends on what you're after. Let's take dandelion, for example. So if all you're trying to do is just burn the top growth off, which a lot of times may be enough, then you can run with a program like we just talked about. Metribuzin, Valor or Authority, Roundup at maybe a quart or something like that, along with some fertilizer. Boy, you got a lot of stuff in there that's going to burn. If you wanted great long-term control on the dandelions, so hopefully they'll never come back again, then I'd run with a half a gallon of Roundup Power Max before I planted my soybeans.
Whatever the max labeled rate is. And here's really where the problem comes, Brian, because a lot of times if guys have a little bit of grass coming, maybe it's green foxtail, yellow foxtail, something like that, and then you've got just a sprinkling of broadleaves out there, guys will say, well, man, I can wipe out that grass with 16 ounces of Power Max, Weather Max really easy, but that's not even close to enough for these broadleaves because they have so many growing points, even at a 2 to 4 inch tall plant.
Yep, and here's the other problem. It's cool in the spring. If you're going to spray when the weather's cool, the stuff just isn't going to work very well. Even Banville, we've used Banville at a pint and it hasn't worked in some cases when we're out there spraying when the weather had been cold for a week, was cold when we sprayed, stayed cold for a couple days afterward. That's just not a good combination. Ideally, here's what we'd like to see. Nighttime temps above 50 degrees 2 days before and 2 days after spraying. If you've got that, chances are you have enough heat to get things going. So just understand, we want the weeds actively growing. We'd like to have the weather a little warmer. You'll have a lot better success that way.
Well, burning down the weeds is certainly an important part of starting clean in the spring, but staying clean all season is going to be tough when you have our Weed of the Week. Can you identify this week's weed?